The cold was not the winter kind, the kind that bites at exposed skin and turns breath to fog. This was a deeper chill, the kind that settles in stone buildings where sunlight never reaches, the kind that lives in parchment and ink. It was the cold of the counting house, a place where warmth was measured in coin and never shared. The air smelled of dust, the particular dust of old paper and dried ink, mixed with the faint metallic scent of the iron stove that did little more than take the edge off the damp. You could hear the scratch of quills, a sound like insects chewing through wood, and beneath that, the steady, rhythmic tap of an abacus. Beads clicking together like teeth chattering. This was where Tomas learned the shape of his cage, not with bars of iron, but with lines of text. He was 14 years old, and his future had been signed away with his father's mark, a shaky X at the bottom of a contract he could not read. The document did not speak of apprenticeship or education. It spoke of service. It spoke of debt. His father owed 40 silver pieces to Master Vorin, the guildsman who owned half the wool trade in the district. The debt was for medicine, for a winter's worth of firewood, for the rent on a crumbling cottage. The contract, written in a tight, precise hand by Vorin's own clerk, stated that the debt would be considered paid in full after 10 years of the boy's faithful labor. 10 years. It did not specify the nature of the labor. It did not guarantee food or shelter or training. It simply bound Tomas, body and soul, to the service of the house of Vorin until he turned 24. The injustice was not a single act of cruelty, not a loaf of sawdust bread or a door slammed in the snow. It was a slow, meticulous process, as careful and deliberate as the bookkeeping that enabled it. It was the injustice of the perfectly legal. The law, you see, protected the agreement. It protected the sanctity of the contract, the clarity of the terms. The law saw a debt and a means of repayment. It did not see a boy. It did not calculate the value of 10 years of a life. It did not smell the ink that bound him, or feel the creeping numbness in his fingers as he copied ledger entries from dawn until the single tallow candle guttered out. His labor began not with a trade, but with errands, fetching, carrying, sweeping the endless floors of the warehouse where wool bales sat like sleeping giants. The work was not skilled, but it was exhaustive. It was designed to be. It filled the hours, it drained the body, it left the mind too tired to question. His name Tomas began to fade. In the house of Vorin he was the boy, the debt boy, the new one. His identity was subsumed into his function. He was a moving part in a machine of profit, a silent figure in the background of transactions that involved sums he could scarcely imagine. They took his labor hour by hour, day by day, in a currency of sweat and silence. They took his name, replacing it with a category, a placeholder. And in taking these, they took his future. The contract was a door that closed behind him. On the other side was a world of possibilities, of learning a craft, of starting a family, of building something that bore his own mark. On this side was the perpetual present of obligation. The future was not his to plan. It belonged to Master Vorin, to the ledger, to the slow, inexorable tally of days until the debt was cleared. But they missed one detail. In their focus on binding the body, on claiming the time, they overlooked the mind. They put him in a room full of information, a fortress of facts and figures. They gave him a menial task, copying the quarterly trade reports. Line after line of numbers, destinations, weights, prices. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but Tomas began to see patterns. He noticed when a shipment to Lyon was recorded at one weight in the warehouse log and a different, lighter weight in the customs ledger. He saw the same merchant's name appear for discounted bulk purchases, but never for the standard sales. He saw the elegant, looping signature of Master Vorin, approving every page, every discrepancy. They thought they were teaching him obedience through monotony. They were, in fact, giving him a map of their own greed drawn in their own hand. Every inconsistency was a crack in the wall of their authority. Every altered figure was a silent confession. He did not yet know what this map meant or how he could use it. He only knew that he saw it. And in that seeing, in that quiet, unnoticed observation, the first seed of a different future was planted. Not a future of rebellion, but of understanding. The system had been built to contain him. He would learn to read it from the inside out. The smell of the counting house changed with the seasons. In spring, it was the damp wool, fresh from the shearing, that filled the air with a greasy animal scent. In summer, the dust from the ledgers mixed with the sweat of the clerks, a dry, papery smell over something human and tired. But it was in winter that Tomas felt the place most deeply. The iron stove glowed dull red, but its heat never reached the corners where he worked. The cold seeped up from the stone floor through the thin soles of his shoes, a constant ache that settled in his bones. His fingers, stained with ink, would grow stiff and clumsy. He would have to blow on them, watching his breath hang in the air, before he could properly grip the quill. The sound was different too. The scratch of pens was slower, more labored. The abacus beads clicked with a sharper, colder sound. And always, underneath everything, was the whisper of turning pages, like the wind outside trying to get in. This was his world. Not the world of the contract, of legal terms and future dates, but the immediate, sensory reality of his captivity. He slept in a narrow alcove off the kitchen, on a pallet of straw that rustled with every turn. The blanket was rough wool, thin from years of use, and it smelled perpetually of wood smoke and old broth. His meals were taken standing at the kitchen board, a bowl of pottage, a heel of bread. He ate quickly, silently, always aware he was in someone else's space. The cook, a woman named Marta with flour permanently dusted in the lines of her hands, never spoke to him. But sometimes, when the kitchen was empty, she would leave an extra piece of bread on the board or a wedge of cheese. She never looked at him when she did it. She would simply turn back to her pots, her back to him, as if the act had never occurred. It was not kindness, not exactly. It was something quieter, an acknowledgement of shared existence within the machine. She was bound there too by different chains, perhaps a widow's need or her own family's debt. She saw another cog grinding away and offered a drop of oil. This was the overlooked ally. Tomas learned to accept these gifts without word or gesture, absorbing the warmth of the bread into his cold hands before he ate it. His survival was not dramatic. There were no bleeding fingers from a loom, no heroic feats of strength. His survival was a study in minute adjustments. He learned to pace his copying so the single candle would last until the task was done. He learned which floorboards creaked so he could move through the dark house without waking anyone. He learned to mend his own clothes with stolen bits of thread, his stitches clumsy but functional. He learned to listen, not just to orders, but to conversations that drifted from Master Vorin's study when the door was left ajar. He heard discussions of tariffs, of guild fees, of the price of alum for fixing dyes. These words meant nothing to him at first, just sounds. But he began to collect them, like the strange, smooth stones he sometimes found in the courtyard. He stored them in his memory, turning them over, examining their shape. His competence grew in the shadows. He noticed that the senior clerk, a man named Alaric, had a particular way of summing columns. He would run his finger down the page, his lips moving silently, then jot the total in the margin. Tomas, from his stool in the corner, began to sum the columns in his head as Alaric worked. At first he was slow, the numbers swam, but day after day he practiced. He found that if he broke the numbers into groups, if he looked for patterns of 10s and 5s, the sums came easier. One afternoon, after a long session of copying tax assessments, Alaric put down his quill and rubbed his eyes. He had been working since dawn. Without looking up, without even seeming to think about it, he spoke. "Boy, what is the sum of this column?" Tomas, startled, looked at the page from across the room. He could not see the numbers clearly, but he had just copied that page. He closed his eyes for a second, seeing the figures in his mind. 427, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alaric looked at him, then back at the page. He picked up his quill, dipped it, and began to add. The scratch of the nib was the only sound. After a long moment, Alaric put the quill down again. He did not look at Tomas. He simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then he went back to his work. No praise, no acknowledgement, just a nod. In that economy it was a fortune. It was the first time his mind, his quiet, observing, calculating mind, had been seen as having value. It was not a skill they had asked for. It was not in the contract. They had bought his hands, his back, his time. They had not thought to price his attention. And in that unpriced attention, in that silent, growing fluency with the language of numbers and records, Tomas began, very slowly. To build a currency they could not tax. He was surviving, yes, but more importantly, he was learning the grammar of his prison. Word by word, number by number, he was learning to read the walls. The system that held Tomas was not a single chain, but an entire architecture of control, built not with malice, but with cold, functional logic. It was the guild. The Wool Merchants' Guild of the city was not just a trade association. It was a legal entity, a political force, and a social contract all woven together. Its power rested on three pillars: exclusion, regulation, and documentation. First, exclusion. Only guild members could buy wool at the official markets, could sell finished cloth within the city walls, could employ more than 2 journeymen. To be outside the guild was to be relegated to the margins of the economy, to peddle scraps in alleyways. Master Vorin's position within this structure was his true wealth, far beyond his ledger balances. Second, regulation. The guild set prices for raw wool. It set quality standards. It dictated the wages for journeymen and apprentices. These rules were not suggestions. They were enforced by guild wardens who could inspect workshops, levy fines, and in extreme cases, revoke membership. The rules created stability for those inside. They also created a ceiling, a limit on how much any worker could ever earn or aspire to. Third, and most crucial for Tomas's understanding, was documentation. Every transaction of significance required a guild-stamped certificate. Every apprenticeship contract, like his own, had to be registered at the guild hall to be valid. This paperwork was the circulatory system of the entire enterprise. It allowed goods and money to flow while maintaining control. It made the invisible visible, turning wool and labor into numbers on a page. This is where Tomas's labor was systematically extracted. His contract was not with Master Vorin the man, but with Master Vorin the guildsman. The guild's registry gave the contract its force. The 10-year term was not arbitrary. Guild law stated that any debt service contract for a minor could not exceed 10 years. Vorin had used the maximum allowable limit. He had not broken any rule. He had exploited its outer boundary. The apprenticeship itself was a fiction. A true apprenticeship followed a formal structure. 7 years was the standard term. The apprentice would live with the master, learn the trade through gradual, supervised tasks, and upon completion become a journeyman. Free to seek work anywhere, Tomas's contract mentioned none of this. It mentioned service, it mentioned debt repayment. In the guild's eyes, and therefore in the law's eyes, he was not an apprentice learning a craft. He was a debt servant, a living surety for his father's 40 silver pieces. This legal categorization was everything. It meant he had no right to training. It meant he had no path to journeyman status. It meant that even after 10 years, he would be released with no guild, recognized skill, no certificate, no future within the system he had served. He would be free, but empty, handed, unqualified, and likely indebted again within a year. The extraction was therefore total. They took his present labor through menial tasks, they took his future potential by denying him education, and they engineered his future dependency by ensuring he would have no means to survive outside their structure. The societal mechanism was elegant in its cruelty. It used the guild's own regulations designed to protect the trade, to instead protect a specific form of exploitation. The wardens would check that Voron's fees were paid, that his wool met grade. They would not check how he used the boy bound to him by debt. That was a private contract matter. The public system was clean, orderly, documented. The private reality, Tomos's reality, was where the cost was borne. He began to see the dual ledgers everywhere. The official guild ledger in the counting house, beautifully kept, showing transactions that complied with every rule. And then the other books, the ones Alaric sometimes worked on late at night, the ones with different columns, different codes, the ones that tracked the unofficial payments to the customs officials, the underweight shipments sold at full price. The wool deliberately misgraded to avoid higher tariffs. The system had a shadow, and the shadow was where the real profit lived. The injustice was not that the system was broken. The injustice was that it worked perfectly. It worked to concentrate power, to obscure exploitation behind a screen of legality and tradition, and to make any challenge seem like an attack on order itself. To rebel was to attack the guild, the city's economy, the very concept of contract law. It was hopeless. But to understand the system, to see its public face and its private shadow, to learn its language and its loopholes, that was not rebellion. That was literacy, and literacy in the right hands could be a quiet, devastating form of power. The exhaustion was a different kind of cold. It did not come from the stone floor or the winter air. It came from the inside, a slow seepage that started in the muscles of his back from hours bent over the desk and settled in his mind like a fine, gray ash. By the end of each day, the numbers he copied ceased to be symbols of commerce. They became just shapes, black marks on a pale field, a task to be completed. This was the personal reality of the systemic extraction. The theft was not of a single, dramatic thing. It was of 1,000 small things, each one barely noticeable, but together they formed the substance of a life. They stole his sleep because the pallet was thin and the kitchen cat would yowl at night. They stole his hunger because the pottage was thin too, and left his stomach feeling hollow an hour later. They stole his time not just in the grand 10-year arc, but in the minute-by-minute erosion of his youth. He was 16 now, 2 years gone. His hands, which should have been learning the feel of tools, the tension of a loom, the weight of a merchant's scale, knew only the smooth wood of a broom handle and the sharp edge of a quill. His fingers were stained a permanent blue-black. When he washed them in the courtyard pump, the cold water would turn cloudy with ink, but the stain remained in the creases of his skin, a map of his labor. The stolen credit was more subtle but more corrosive. One afternoon, Master Voron received a visit from a merchant from Ghent. There was a discrepancy in an invoice, a question about a shipment of fine Spanish wool. The figures were complex, involving tariffs paid in 2 different ports and a brokerage fee. Alaric was summoned, but he had taken ill with a fever and was abed. Voron, impatient, snapped his fingers at Tomos. "Fetch the ledger for last autumn, the customs book for the port of Antwerp, and the broker's correspondence." Tomos did so. He laid them out on the desk. Voron and the merchant pored over them, arguing in low, tense voices. Tomas stood by the door, waiting to be dismissed. He looked at the open pages. He saw the problem immediately. The broker had calculated the fee as a percentage of the wool's value after tariffs. But the invoice from Ghent assumed the fee was on the value before tariffs. It was a small difference, but it added up to several silver pieces. He said nothing. He was the boy. His opinion had no value, his observation no weight. After several minutes of frustration, Vorin slammed his hand on the desk. "This is wasting my time," he growled. "Alaric will sort it when he is well." The merchant left displeased. Tomas was told to put the books away. As he closed the ledger, he looked once more at the numbers. He knew the answer. It sat in his mind, clear and complete, but it was not his to give. His competence was invisible, a resource they used without acknowledging its source, like the light from the window they never thanked. The erasure of identity was the quietest theft of all. In the house, he was the boy. In the city, he was no one. When he was sent on errands to deliver a message or fetch a parcel from the docks, he moved through the streets like a ghost. People looked through him. He had no trade to announce, no guild badge to wear, no family name that meant anything here. He was a function, a pair of hands carrying something. This erasure was not violent. It was a gradual fading. His own memories of home, of his father's face, of the smell of the forest near their village, began to feel like stories about someone else. They were soft, blurred at the edges. The present reality of ink and dust and cold was sharp, immediate, undeniable. This was the connection between the abstract system and the living boy. The guild laws created the category of debt servant. Master Vorin exploited that category, and the result was this daily, sensory experience of diminishment. The system did not need to hate him. It simply needed to not see him. It needed to categorize him, to process him, and in doing so, it stripped him of everything that made him an individual. His pain was not in wounds, but in absence. The absence of rest, of fulfillment, of recognition, of a future that bore his own name. Yet within this very erosion a current began to flow. His mind, forced into the narrow channel of rote copying, began to find its own paths. He started to play a silent game. As he copied a column of figures, he would try to hold the entire sum in his head before he wrote the total. He would look at a page of shipments and try to guess the total weight before adding it. He began to recognize the handwriting of the various customs officials, the different stamps used in different ports. This was not part of his duty. It was a secret rebellion of attention. They owned his time and his labor. They did not own the quality of his attention. That, he began to realize, was the one thing they could not tax, could not measure, could not truly control. And so, in the heart of the machine designed to erase him, he began, secretly, meticulously, to build a self. Not with grand actions, but with silent observations. Not with rebellion, but with a deeper, more patient form of understanding. The kitchen at night had its own sounds, the settling of the great brick oven as it cooled, a series of soft pops and cracks like distant footsteps. The scuttle of a mouse in the pantry, a quick, dry rustle, the slow drip of water from the pump into the stone sink. Tomas would lie on his pallet, listening to this night music, the blanket pulled up to his chin. The cook, Marta, often worked late, preparing dough for the morning or salting meat for storage. She moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, her shadow huge on the wall from the single rushlight. She never sang, never hummed. Her work was a silent ritual. One evening, deep in winter, Tomas woke shivering. The fire in the kitchen hearth had died to embers, and a bitter draught whistled under the door from the courtyard. He lay still, trying to will warmth back into his limbs, listening to the wind. He heard a different sound then, not the wind, a soft, rhythmic scraping. He turned his head. Marta was at the table, her back to him. She was sharpening a knife on a whetstone. The sound was steady, patient. S-H-H-H-K, S-H-H-H-K, S-H-H-H-K. After a long time she stopped. She tested the edge against her thumb, nodded once to herself, and laid the knife down. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, wrapped bundle. She placed it on the corner of the table nearest his palate. Without a word, without even glancing in his direction, she took the rushlight and left for her room upstairs. The kitchen plunged into near darkness, lit only by the faint red glow from the hearth. Tomas waited until he heard her door close. He got up, his bare feet cold on the stone floor, and went to the table. The bundle was a piece of cloth, rough homespun, tied with string. He undid it. Inside was a heel of dark rye bread, a thick slice of yellow cheese, and 2 dried apples. It was more food than he saw in 2 days of meals. He stood there in the dark, holding the bundle, the smell of the cheese sharp and rich in the cold air. He did not feel joy or even gratitude in that moment. He felt something more complex, a recognition. She saw him, not as the debt boy, not as a function, but as a human being who was cold and hungry. This was the overlooked ally, not a rescuer, not a guide to secret treasure, just another person bound in service, who understood the economy of survival. Her gift was not charity, it was a transaction in a different currency, the currency of shared silence, of unspoken understanding. She could not change his contract, she could not teach him a trade, but she could, in this small, defiant way, acknowledge that he existed. The next morning, when he passed her at the board where she was kneading dough, he did not thank her. He simply met her eyes for half a second and gave the slightest nod, just as Alaric had done to him. She gave no sign she had seen it. But her hands paused in their work for just one breath before continuing. That was the acknowledgment returned. This quiet connection became a thread in the fabric of his days. Sometimes, when he was sent to fetch water from the courtyard pump, he would find she had already filled the kitchen buckets. When he had to gather kindling in the damp wood shed, he would sometimes find a small, dry bundle left near the door. He began to do the same in return. If he finished his copying early and the kitchen was empty, he would sweep the floor for her, or bring in an extra armful of firewood. No words were ever exchanged about these acts. They were a silent language, a grammar of mutual aid developed between 2 people who had nothing to give but their attention and their labor. It was through Marta, indirectly, that he learned another lesson. One afternoon he heard her arguing with a peddler at the back door. The man was trying to sell her some spices at an inflated price, claiming they were from the Orient. Marta listened, her arms crossed. Then she said, in her flat, unimpressed voice, "The guild rate for pepper is 12 pence an ounce. Your seal is from the Hamburg market, not Venice. That pepper is 6 pence an ounce, at best. You can take your price, or you can take your goods elsewhere." The peddler, stunned into silence, finally muttered a lower price, which she accepted. Tomas, fetching onions from the pantry, heard every word. He realized Marta knew the guild rates for provisions. She knew how to read a merchant's seal. She had a practical, ground-level understanding of the very system that bound them both. She was not powerless within her domain. She had expertise, and she used it to defend the household's resources, and by extension, her own position. This was a revelation. Survival was not just endurance, it was competence. It was knowing the rules well enough to navigate within them, to push back at the edges, to claim small spaces of autonomy. The cook, with her knowledge of spice markets, was as much a practitioner of the system as the merchant with his ledgers. She fought with her trade. Tomas began to see his own situation through this lens. His trade, such as it was numbers and records. It was the language of the system that held him. Marta's quiet gifts and quieter competence showed him that the first step to using that language was not to shout, but to listen. To learn its vocabulary, its rhythms, its true prices. I was not going to lead him out of the woods. She was showing him how to read the trees. The law, in its majestic equality, forbade the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. This old observation captures the essence of the system Tomas navigated. The rules were the same for everyone, but their impact was not. The loopholes ordinary people relied on were not secret passages written in invisible ink. They were cracks in the facade of the rules themselves, inconsistencies between theory and practice, between the law as written and the law as enforced. To find them, one had to understand medieval contract law not as a moral code, but as a technical manual. The first loophole was in the requirement for witnesses. A debt contract, especially one involving a minor, required 2 witnesses of good standing to attest that the terms were understood and agreed upon. The contract binding Tomas had 2 names at the bottom, below his father's mark. One was a guild brother of Vorin's. The other was a tavern keeper from a nearby parish. On the surface, it was valid. But guild law had a specific clause. For a contract of service exceeding 5 years, at least 1 witness must be a relative of the minor or a designated guardian from the parish council. To ensure the child's interest was represented, Vorin's contract was for 10 years. Neither witness was a relative or a guardian. This was a procedural error. It did not make the contract automatically void. It made it contestable. It created a hook, a point of leverage, if one knew where to look and had the standing to pull. The second loophole was in the ink. This sounds trivial, but it was not. Guild regulations for registered contracts stipulated the use of iron gall ink, made from oak galls and iron salts, for its permanence. Cheaper inks made from soot or berries would fade over time. The contract in the guild registry was written in proper iron gall ink. But Tomas, in his endless copying, had seen the original, the one that had been signed. He had noticed in the strong light from the window one day that the witness signatures were a slightly different black, a softer, less metallic shade. He suspected, though he could not prove, that the original signatures might have been added later with a different ink. If the original contract presented for registry differed in any material way from the copy held by the guild, the registry could be challenged. The burden of proof would be on Vorin to produce the original and demonstrate its authenticity. The third and most powerful loophole was in the concept of consideration. A contract required consideration, something of value exchanged by both parties. Tomas's father received 40 silver pieces. Tomas provided 10 years of service, but what did Tomas receive? The contract promised nothing but the cancellation of the debt. It promised no training, no board beyond basic sustenance, no wages, no path to a future. Under some interpretations of customary law, a contract that demanded everything from one party and gave nothing but a prior obligation in return could be seen as unconscionable, especially for a minor. It lacked mutual benefit. This was a dangerous, abstract argument. It attacked the very heart of debt bondage. It was not a loophole one could walk through easily. It was a philosophical fault line, but it existed. The final loophole was the simplest and often the most effective. Time, contracts had to be performed, services had to be rendered. But the law recognized that circumstances changed. If the nature of the service changed dramatically from what was originally implied, the contract could be voided. Tomas's contract said service. It did not specify the tasks. If Vorin began using him for work that was dangerous or illegal or fundamentally different from the general labor of a merchant's household, that could be grounds for dissolution. The trap, therefore, was not a single mechanism. It was a web of potential failures, each one small, each one technical, each one rooted in the system's own obsession with form and procedure. The powerful relied on the assumption that the powerless did not know the rules well enough to spot where the rules had been broken. They assumed illiteracy, both of letters and of law. Tomas's survival strategy shifted. It was no longer just about enduring or even about understanding the business. It was about forensics. He began with immense caution to gather evidence. He could not take documents, but he could remember them. He committed the witness names to memory. He noted the exact phrasing of the consideration clause. He studied the ink whenever he had a chance to handle the original contract, which was rare, storing the visual detail in his mind. He listened for any order that might cross the line from drudgery into something else. He was looking for the one detail they had missed, not a detail in the ledger, but a detail in the legal architecture that held him. He was learning that the system's greatest strength, its reliance on precise documentation and procedure, was also its greatest weakness. For every rule that bound him, there was a corollary rule about how that rule must be applied. And in the space between the rule and its application, in the tiny gaps of human error and arrogance, lay the possibility of freedom. Understanding the system from within was not an academic exercise. It was a practical skill, like knowing which floorboards creaked or how to sharpen a quill. Tomas began to apply his growing literacy to the daily reality of the House of Vorin. He learned which officials could be bribed, not by witnessing the act, but by reading the results. In the customs ledger, shipments cleared by a certain inspector always had lower assessed values, and the handwriting in the notes column was unusually neat, as if the inspector was being careful. In the guild fee book, payments recorded by a particular clerk were always rounded to the nearest shilling, never the exact penny, suggesting small amounts were being pocketed. These were not crimes he could report. They were the grease that made the machine run. They were also points of vulnerability. A man who took a bribe once would likely take one again. His loyalty was to coin, not to law or to Master Vorin. This knowledge was dangerous, but it was also a kind of map. It showed where the formal structure was weak, where personal interest overrode official duty. Tomas learned which records were poorly kept. The inventory of the warehouse was a masterpiece of confusion. Bales were marked with codes that corresponded to no ledger he had ever seen. Quantities were recorded in stones in one book and in pounds in another, with no consistent conversion. This was not incompetence. It was deliberate obfuscation. It allowed Vorin to claim losses to damp, to pilferage, to accounting errors. It created a fog through which extra profit could be moved unseen. For Tomas, this fog was also a hiding place. In the chaos of the inventory, an extra observation, a note of a real weight versus a recorded weight, could be lost. He began in the deepest privacy of his mind to keep a second set of books, not written down but memorized. He would note when a bale marked as 50 stones felt heavier when he helped move it. He would remember the actual count of sacks unloaded from a cart versus the number entered in the day book. This mental ledger was his alone. It was a record of the truth, or as close to it as he could get, hidden in the one place they could not search. The most important lesson was learning which procedures were routinely ignored. The guild required that all apprentices, even debt servants, be brought before the annual guild muster for a roll call. Vorin had never taken Tomas. The procedure was a formality, but its omission was a fact. The law required that a copy of any contract involving a minor be filed with the parish council where the minor resided. Tomas's contract was only in the guild registry. The parish had no copy. These ignored procedures were like unlocked doors in a fortress everyone assumed was sealed. They were breaches of protocol so common that the powerful forgot they were breaches. They relied on the fact that no one would check, that no one would remember the rule, that the boy himself would not know to ask. Tomas now knew. He knew the muster rule from overhearing Alaric complain about having to prepare the paperwork for the journeymen. He knew the parish filing rule from copying a legal compendium for Vorin's lawyer, a tedious job that had burned the clause into his memory. This was the integration. The abstract loopholes in contract law met the gritty reality of bureaucratic laziness and corruption. The witness requirement flaw was a legal technicality. Vorin's failure to file with the parish was an administrative sin. Together they were stronger. One showed the contract was improperly constituted. The other showed it was improperly executed. Tomas began to see his path not as a dramatic escape, but as a meticulous audit. He was auditing his own bondage. He was comparing the reality of his situation against the rulebook that supposedly governed it, and he was finding discrepancies. Not large, shouting discrepancies, but small, quiet ones. A missing signature here, an unfiled document there, a task outside the implied scope of service. A payment that did not match a record. Each one alone was nothing. A busy official would wave it away. But collected together, presented not as an emotional plea, but as a series of factual, procedural errors, they could form a case. They could create doubt. They could force Vorin to defend not his morality, but his paperwork, and in defending his paperwork, he would have to expose more of it. He would have to bring the original contract into the light. He would have to explain the witness selection. He would have to account for the missing parish copy. The trap was being built from the system's own neglected paperwork. Tomas's role was to be the quiet accountant who had noticed the books did not balance. His trade was no longer mere copying, it was verification, and in a system built on the sanctity of written records, the verifier held a strange, latent power. He just had to learn how and when to present his findings. Tomas's story was not an isolated incident. It was a variation on a theme played out across centuries and continents. To understand the logic of his potential escape, one must place it in the long arc of human history, in the persistent struggle between the powerful who write the rules and the powerless who must live within them. Long before guilds and contracts, there were other systems of bondage, debt slavery in ancient Mesopotamia, recorded on clay tablets. The Roman law of patria potestas, giving a father absolute power over his children, including the right to sell them into bondage to settle debts. Serfdom in medieval Europe, binding peasants to the land through a web of customary obligations and inherited status. In each of these systems, the formal law protected the property rights of the master, the creditor, the lord. Rebellion was suicide. Open defiance meant brutal punishment, often death, and so the stories that survived, the folk tales and cunning fables, were not about revolution. They were about navigation. They were survival manuals for the inside. Consider the archetype of the clever slave in Roman comedy, the servant who outwits his master through guile and wordplay, not force. Or the countless fairy tales where the youngest son, with no inheritance, wins a kingdom not by strength of arms, but by kindness to animals, by solving riddles, by paying attention to details others miss. These stories served a psychological and social purpose. They taught that when you cannot change the system, you must learn to see it more clearly than those who benefit from it. They taught that the system's greatest weakness is often its own complexity, its self-assurance. Its belief that those on the bottom lack the capacity to understand the machinery above them. Historically, the loopholes people relied on were often rooted in this disparity of attention. The lord was concerned with grand strategy, with politics, with display. The serf was concerned with the specific boundaries of the strip field, with the exact wording of the village custom, with the timing of the harvest. The master thought in years and fortunes, the servant thought in days and meals. This difference in focus created opportunities. A feudal custom might require 3 days of labor per week on the lord's demesne. But it might also specify that the labor was for plowing and reaping. If the lord demanded a 4th day for ditch digging, that was a breach of custom. It was a small thing, but it was a point of leverage. The serf might not refuse outright, but he might work slower. He might bring a complaint to the manor court, not as rebellion, but as a request for clarification of the custom. He would be using the lord's own legal system to check the lord's power. Similarly, in many cultures, debt bondage had limits. A Hebrew servant, according to ancient law, was to be freed in the 7th year. A Babylonian debt slave could be released if the value of his labor exceeded the original debt. These were not rights granted out of kindness. They were pressure valves built into the system to prevent total collapse from resentment. The clever and the desperate learned to find these valves and turn them. Tomos's situation was a late medieval version of this ancient dynamic. The guild system and contract law were the new technology of control, more sophisticated than custom, more portable than land tenure. But the human logic was the same. The powerful overreach, they become sloppy, they assume the powerless are ignorant, and in that assumption they leave a door unlocked. The historical lesson is that intelligence in these contexts is not about abstract cleverness. It is a specific, applied skill. It is the ability to read the specific rules of your cage better than your jailer does. It is the patience to wait for the right moment, when a procedural error can be exposed not as a personal grievance, but as a threat to the system's own legitimacy. For if one contract is flawed, how many others might be? The guild, the court, the authorities, they have an interest in maintaining the appearance of order and legality. A master who breaks his own rules too openly becomes a liability. He exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of the system. The historical precedent gave Tomos's quiet study a deeper meaning. He was not just gathering facts. He was walking a path worn by millions before him. He was learning the oldest trick in the book of the oppressed. When you cannot break the chains, examine the links, find the one that is poorly forged, and then, with infinite care, apply pressure. The skill grew in the silence, in the spaces between orders, in the focused quiet of a mind with nowhere else to go. It began with the hand. Tomos's copying, once a child's clumsy scrawl, began to change. He watched Alaric's hand, the elegant, economical flow of the letters, the consistent slant, the perfect spacing. He started to mimic it, not on important documents, but on scraps of waste parchment, on the margins of his own practice sheets. He would shape a single letter over and over, the curve of a G, the cross of a T, until his fingers ached. It was not art, it was craft. The goal was not beauty, but clarity and speed. A hand that could not be distinguished from the master clerk's was a hand that could be trusted with more than copying. It was a hand that could, perhaps one day, write something of its own. The memory was the second skill. He practiced holding numbers. He would look at a page of figures for a count of 10, then look away and recite them back to himself. He started with short columns, then longer ones. He learned tricks, grouping numbers into pairs, remembering the shape of a total rather than each digit. He found that if he associated a number with a sensory detail, the weight of a bale, the smell of the ink he was using, it stuck better. His memory became a ledger, a silent, internal archive of facts. He could recall the price of Flemish wool from 2 seasons ago. He could remember the tonnage of a ship called the Grey Gull that had docked in spring. This was not just rote memorization, It was pattern recognition. He began to see the story the numbers told. A sudden drop in the price of alum meant a new source had been found or a tariff lifted. A spike in orders from Lyon meant a fashion for a certain weave had taken hold there. The numbers ceased to be abstract. They became signals, a code broadcasting the intentions and fortunes of men he had never met. The third skill was the most subtle and the most powerful. He learned to listen to the quality of a silence. In the counting house, not all silences were the same. There was the busy silence of concentration, filled with the scratch of pens. There was the tense silence when Master Vorin was displeased, a thick, heavy quiet that made the air feel cold. And there was the calculating silence when Vorin and Alaric would pore over a document, not speaking but thinking. Tomas learned to distinguish them. He learned that the calculating silence often preceded a decision that would be recorded in the shadow ledger, the one for unofficial business. By listening to the silence, he could sometimes predict what would appear in the books the next day. His competence was a quiet, accumulating force. It had no immediate outlet. He was still the boy who fetched and carried. But the change was noticed in small ways. Alaric began to give him slightly more complex tasks, not analysis, but preparation. Sort these invoices by date. Find the entry for this broker in the ledger for last year. These were tests. Tomas performed them flawlessly, quickly, without asking unnecessary questions. He was building a reputation for reliability within the narrow confines of his station. One afternoon, a crisis occurred. A guild warden arrived for a surprise inspection of Vorin's trade certificates for the past quarter. Vorin was away at the docks. Alaric was frantically searching for a particular file, a bundle of customs stamps from Antwerp that had been misfiled. The warden, a stern man with a waxed moustache, tapped his foot impatiently. Alaric's face was pale. Losing a guild certificate was a finnable offense. Tomas, who had been sweeping the floor, stopped. He had filed that bundle 2 weeks prior, under a broker's name because the port designation was smudged. He knew exactly where it was. He said nothing. He waited. Alaric turned to him, his voice tight with stress. Have you seen the Antwerp stamps, the ones in the blue ribbon? Tomas met his eyes. I filed them under the broker's name, Sir Coenan, the third shelf. Alaric stared at him for a second, then rushed to the shelf. He pulled out the bundle. The warden examined the stamps, nodded, and made a note in his own book. The inspection continued without further incident. After the warden left, Alaric did not thank Tomas. He simply looked at him for a long moment, then went back to his desk. But that evening, when Tomas went to the kitchen for his meal, he found a second bowl of pottage next to his usual one. Marta was not in the room. The gift was anonymous, but its meaning was clear. His competence had just paid a dividend. It had saved the house trouble and potential loss. It had been noticed. This was the quiet virtue, not heroic strength, not magical intervention, just precise, reliable skill applied at the right moment. It was the weaver's bleeding fingers translated into the clerk's stained hands and trained memory. He was becoming good at his unintended trade. And in becoming good, he was becoming, slowly, quietly, indispensable, not as a person, but as a function. And sometimes, being a vital function is the first step towards being seen as a person. The overlooked detail was not in the contract. It was in him. They had bought a boy's labor. They were getting a clerk's mind. And they did not yet have a price for that. The shift was gradual, almost imperceptible. Tomas stopped being a passive victim of the system and began to be an active navigator within it. He started to use the rules not to rebel against them, but to turn them to his own subtle advantage. The first maneuver was finding contradictions. He was given the task of reconciling the warehouse tally sheets with the sales ledger. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, checking that every bale sold was accounted for, but he approached it as a puzzle. he found a discrepancy. A sale of 20 bales of medium-grade wool to a merchant in Bruges was recorded in the sales ledger, but the warehouse release note, signed by the foreman, only listed 18. 2 bales were missing. The value was significant. He brought the discrepancy to Alaric, not as an accusation, but as a question of procedure. "Sir, the ledger and the release note do not match for the Bruges shipment. Which record should I consider correct for the inventory adjustment?" He presented it as a problem of bookkeeping, not of theft. Alaric looked at the documents, his face unreadable. He knew what it meant. The foreman had likely siphoned off 2 bales for a side deal, or they had been lost and he was covering his error. "Use the release note," Alaric said after a moment. "The ledger must be in error." Then he added quietly, "Make a note of the adjustment in the margin of the ledger. Initial it." This was instruction. Alaric was having him document the discrepancy officially, but minimally, in a way that protected the house by showing a correction had been made, while also creating a record that could be used against the foreman if needed. Tomas had just been used as a tool in an internal power struggle. But he had also been given a lesson: document everything, even the errors, especially the errors. The second maneuver was exploiting procedural errors. He was copying the quarterly guild fee report. The calculation was complex, based on a percentage of declared trade volume. As he copied, he checked the arithmetic. Voren's clerk had made a mistake. He had applied the percentage to the gross volume, not the net volume after allowable deductions. The error resulted in an overpayment of about 5 silver pieces, a small sum for Voren but not trivial. Tomas finished the copy, making the same mistake. He did not correct it, but he remembered it. That error, lodged in his memory, was a piece of potential leverage. If Voren ever needed a favor from the guild clerk who processed the fees, pointing out the overpayment generously could be a way to build credit. Or if relations soured, it could be presented as evidence of careless accounting. The information was neutral. Its use depended on the context. The third and most daring maneuver was creating documentation trails. He was often tasked with preparing clean copies of letters for Voren's signature. The originals with their edits and blots were usually discarded. Tomas began very carefully to preserve one original draft of each important letter. He would smooth the crumpled parchment and hide it between the pages of a large, seldom used ledger in the back of the storage room. He was building an archive. This archive contained the unvarnished versions of Voren's communications, showing his initial demands, his raw calculations, his unfiltered opinions of competitors and officials. It was a record of intent before the polish of the final copy. This was dangerous. If discovered, it would be seen as espionage, but it was also a form of insurance. In a dispute over the meaning of a contract or a letter, the original draft could be crucial. He was learning to fight with his trade. His trade was information. His weapons were memory, precision, and paperwork. He was setting traps made of ink and precedent. The trap for the foreman was the marginal note. The trap for the guild clerk was the arithmetic error. The trap for Voren himself was the archive of original intent. None of these were sprung. They were set, waiting. This was the essence of the strategy: do not confront, prepare, accumulate facts. Understand the procedures so thoroughly that you can see where others have deviated from them. Then hold that knowledge quietly until the moment it becomes useful. The moment might never come, but if it did, he would be ready. He was no longer just surviving the system. He was learning to garden within it, planting seeds of information in the cracks of its formalism, tending them with silent attention, waiting to see what might grow. The system demanded obedience. He gave it meticulousness. It demanded his labor. He gave it a scrutiny it had not asked for. And in that gap between demand and offering, he found the narrow path of his own agency. Power in the city was not held by individuals alone. It was held by networks, intricate webs of obligation, favor, and mutual interest that stretched from the Guildhall to the cathedral to the docks. Master Vorin's authority over Tomas was not just legal, it was social. He was embedded in a system of reciprocal debts far more complex than the one on parchment. He owed favors to other guildsmen. He was owed favors by customs officials. He made regular donations to the parish church, which gave him influence with the priest. He employed men whose families relied on his wages. This network was his true fortress. To attack him directly was to attack this entire structure. It would trigger a defense not just from Vorin, but from all those whose status was intertwined with his. The guild would close ranks, the priest would preach about respecting masters, the foreman and journeymen would see a threat to their own precarious positions. This was why rebellion was framed as the most dangerous path. It was not just physically dangerous, it was socially suicidal. It isolated the rebel, marking him as an enemy of order itself. Tomas had to navigate these social dynamics without triggering this collective defense. He had to find a way to separate Vorin from his network, or to use the network against him. The key was in the nature of the obligations. The network functioned on trust and reputation. A guildsman was expected to be competent, to honor his contracts, to maintain a facade of legality and piety. His credit, both financial and social, depended on this facade. If that facade cracked, the network could turn from a shield into a cage. The other guildsmen would not protect a member who became a liability, who attracted the scrutiny of the law or the church in a way that threatened them all. They would distance themselves. They might even sacrifice him to preserve the integrity of the whole. Tomas's strategy, therefore, could not be to prove Vorin was evil. It had to be to prove he was careless. It had to demonstrate that Vorin's exploitation was not just a private matter, but a source of risk to the system. The procedural errors in Tomas's contract were perfect for this. They were not crimes of passion. They were sins against bureaucracy. They showed that Vorin did not respect the guild's own rules for contracting minors. This made him a weak link. If he cut corners here, where else might he cut corners? In his quality stamps, in his tax payments, in his dealings with other guildsmen. The question, once planted, was corrosive. Similarly, using Tomas for tasks outside the implied scope of service was not just cruelty. It was a breach of the social contract between master and servant, however unequal that contract was. If Vorin could treat a debt servant as mere chattel, what did that say about his respect for any hierarchy, any boundary? The social dynamics gave Tomas a narrow path. He needed an ally within the network, someone who had their own reasons to want Vorin checked. Alaric was a possibility. As head clerk, his reputation was tied to the accuracy of the books. If Vorin's corner-cutting led to a major scandal, Alaric would be blamed. He had an interest in maintaining a minimum standard of procedure. The parish priest was another. If it could be shown that Vorin had failed to file a contract with the parish, it was an insult to the priest's authority and a neglect of pastoral duty. The priest might intervene not out of compassion for Tomas, but to assert his own jurisdiction. Tomas's navigation had to be invisible. He could not be seen as a troublemaker. He had to be the opposite, the model servant. The one who pointed out discrepancies only to ensure the records were correct, the one who remembered the rules. In doing so, he would slowly, carefully, expose the places where Vorin had forgotten them. He would not accuse, he would inquire, he would not demand, he would present facts. The goal was to make Vorin's own greed and carelessness the problem, not Tomas's desire for freedom. The conflict would then not be between a master and a rebellious servant. It would be between a master and the system he purported to uphold. And in that conflict, the system, with its deep investment in its own legitimacy, would often side with itself. It was a dangerous game. If Vorin sensed the threat, he could crush Tomas effortlessly. But if Tomas played it perfectly, if he became the living embodiment of the rules Vorin ignored, then Vorin, in trying to destroy him, would be seen as attacking the rules themselves. The social dynamics were a minefield, but they were also a hall of mirrors. And Tomas was learning to hold up a mirror very still and let Vorin see his own reflection. It happened on a day like any other. The air in the counting house was thick with the smell of dust and the metallic tang of ink. A beam of pale spring sunlight cut through the high window, illuminating a million motes dancing in the air. Tomas was on his knees, sorting through a chest of old correspondence, looking for a particular bill of lading from 3 years prior. The chest smelled of mildew and old paper, a damp, sweet rot. His fingers were black with dust. He pulled out bundle after bundle, each tied with faded ribbon. He was about to give up when he saw it, tucked at the very bottom, not in a bundle but lying loose. A single sheet of parchment folded in quarters. It was heavier than the letters around it. He unfolded it carefully. The crackle of the old paper was loud in the quiet room. It was a contract, but not a copy, the original. The paper was of a different quality, thicker with a rougher edge. And there at the bottom was his father's mark, a shaky, desperate X. Next to it were the 2 witness signatures. He stared at them. He knew these names from the registered copy, but here, in the original, the ink was different, as he had suspected. The signatures were a flat, dull black, the ink of common oak gall but poorly mixed. The rest of the contract, the body text written in a neat clerk's hand, was in the rich, blue-black iron gall ink, the proper ink. But the signatures had been added later. He could see it now, clearly. The pen strokes for the signatures sat on top of the text in a few places, a tiny overlap visible only in the slanting sunlight. They had been added after the contract was written. This was not just a procedural error about witness qualification. This was evidence of fabrication. The contract had been written, and then the witnesses had signed it, perhaps without his father present, perhaps without understanding the terms. Or perhaps the signatures were forgeries altogether. His heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. He did not feel triumph. He felt a cold, clear focus. This was the detail, the one they had missed. They had been so careful with the copy in the guild registry, written in perfect ink, perfectly formatted. They had forgotten about the original. They had assumed it was lost, or they had simply not cared, believing no one would ever look for it, and if they did, they would not know what to look for. He held the document in his hands. The paper felt like dry skin. He memorized everything, the exact shade of the 2 inks, the overlap of the strokes, the texture of the paper, the faint water stain in one corner. He committed it to the archive of his mind. Then, with infinite care, he refolded it exactly as it had been and placed it back at the bottom of the chest. He covered it with the other bundles. He closed the lid. The moment passed. The sunbeam moved on, leaving the corner in shadow. The dust settled. Tomas went back to sorting the papers, his movements calm, methodical, but inside everything had changed. He had found the keystone, the original flawed document. All his other knowledge, the unfiled parish copy, the missed guild muster, the questionable witness status, they were supporting arguments. This was the core. If the original contract was improperly executed, the entire edifice of his bondage was built on sand. The law cared deeply about originals. The registry was just a record. The original was the fact. He had to be more careful than ever now. Possession of this knowledge was more dangerous than ever. If Vorin realized Tomas had seen the original and understood its flaw, He would become a direct threat. He would be silenced one way or another. Tomas's strategy crystallized. He could not keep this document. He could not steal it. It was safest where it was, forgotten. His power was in knowing it existed and knowing exactly where it was. His task now was to create a situation where that knowledge could be used. He needed a reason for a neutral authority, a guild warden or a parish officer, to demand to see the original contract. And he needed to be able to lead them to it. He needed to force an audit. The discovery was not the end. It was the beginning of the most delicate phase. He had the map. Now he had to chart a course through minefields to reach the destination. He got up from the floor, brushed the dust from his knees, and went to wash his hands. The water ran black, then clear. He looked at his reflection in the bucket, the face of the dead boy, pale and serious. But behind those eyes now was a secret, a quiet, burning certainty. They had missed one detail, and he had found it. The precise legal mechanism Tomas would use was not a single law, but a sequence of procedural triggers, a cascade of administrative failure. It began with the Guild's own bylaws, specifically Statute 15, Clause 7. This clause stated that for any contract of service for a minor registered with the Guild, a copy must also be filed with the parish council of the minor's residence within 60 days of signing. The purpose was to give the parish, as the traditional guardian of the poor and fatherless, oversight. Failure to file did not automatically void the contract, but it rendered the Guild registration provisional, pending correction. Master Vorin had never filed a copy with the parish. This was the first trigger. The second mechanism was in the city's municipal code, a rule often overlooked. Any provisional Guild registration that remained uncorrected for a period exceeding 3 years could be challenged before the city's clerk of contracts, an official appointed by the mayor. The challenge had to be brought by a person with standing, which typically meant a guild warden, a parish officer, or a relative of the minor. Tomas had no relatives here, but the parish priest, if properly informed, would have standing. He would be obligated to investigate a potential neglect of his pastoral duty. The third mechanism was the demand for the original. If a challenge was formally lodged, the clerk of contracts had the authority to demand production of the original signed document for verification against the Guild copy. This was a routine check, but a powerful one. It assumed both parties could produce their originals. If Vorin could not produce the original, or if the original showed material discrepancies from the registered copy, the registration could be suspended pending a full inquiry. The discrepancy in the ink, the evidence that the witness signatures were added later, would be a material discrepancy. It would suggest the contract was not executed properly at the time of signing. This would shift the burden of proof onto Vorin. He would have to prove the contract was valid. He would have to find the witnesses, bring them before the clerk, have them attest to the signing. Given that one witness was a guild brother who might lie for him, and the other was a tavern keeper who might be bribed or intimidated, this was not impossible, but it was a risk. It would draw attention, it would create a record, and it would cost Vor in time, money, and social capital. The fourth and final mechanism was the concept of lashes, a principle of equity. If a party sleeps on their rights, if they allow a flawed situation to persist for too long without taking steps to correct it, they can lose the right to enforce it. Tomas's contract was now in its 4th year. Vorin had 4 years to file with the parish and had not done so. He had 4 years to ensure the original was in order. His inaction could be used against him. It could be argued that by failing to follow the proper procedures, he had forfeited the strict enforcement of the contract's terms. The Court of Equity might modify the terms or even void it in the interest of fairness. This was the weakest part of the chain, the most abstract. But combined with the concrete procedural failures, it added weight. The trap, therefore, was a legal and administrative one. Tomas's role was to pull the first trigger, to set the sequence in motion. He had to get the parish priest to formally inquire about the missing filing. That inquiry would force the guild to check its records. That check would reveal the provisional status. That status would allow a challenge to be lodged with the clerk of contracts. That challenge would demand the original, and the original would reveal the flaw. Tomas would not be the accuser, he would be the catalyst. He would provide the information quietly to the right person at the right time in the right way. He would make the system enforce its own rules against one of its own. The mechanism was beautiful in its cold logic. It used the bureaucracy's love of procedure against the individual who thought himself above it. It turned the system's sluggishness, its obsession with paperwork, into a weapon. The plan was fraught with danger. The priest might not care, the guild might cover for Vorin, the clerk might be corrupt. But each of those failures would itself be a day, to point a further crack in the facade, and Tomas would still have his knowledge. He could wait. He could try again. He had time, 4 years gone, 6 to go. But he did not intend to wait 6 years. He intended to use the time he had left to prepare the ground, to choose his moment, to make his move not as a desperate slave, but as a petitioner for due process. The law, in all its majestic equality, was about to be invited to look at a piece of paper. And on that paper, in the difference between 2 shades of black, hung a boy's future. The preparation was a silent, interior campaign. Tomas began to gather his evidence, not on paper, but in the architecture of his memory. He rehearsed the facts, the names of the witnesses, their status, the date of the contract. The specific clause in the guild bylaws about parish filing, Statute 15, Clause 7. He practiced reciting it in his mind, word for word, as he had seen it in the legal compendium. He visualized the original document, the 2 shades of ink, the overlap of the pen strokes. He fixed the location in his memory, the chest, the bottom, under the bundle of letters from the Hamburg broker. This mental dossier had to be perfect, retrievable in an instant under pressure. He also began to prepare the ground externally with infinite caution. His relationship with Alaric was key. He needed Alaric to see him not as a threat, but as a useful, perhaps even slightly pitiable, fixture who knew the rules. He doubled his diligence. His copying was flawless, his filing was precise, he anticipated needs. If Alaric was looking for a particular ledger, Tomas would have it ready before being asked. He became a model of silent efficiency. He also began, very subtly, to display his knowledge of procedure. One day, Alaric was preparing the quarterly report for the guild, and cursed under his breath about the complexity of the fee calculation. Tomas, from his stool, said quietly, without looking up, "It is the net volume after the brokerage deduction, sir, not the gross." Alaric stopped. He looked at the formula, then at Tomas. He did not thank him. He simply grunted and made the correction, but the point was made. The boy understood the rules. Another time, when a junior apprentice from another merchant's house delivered a message, Tomas, who was receiving it, noticed the seal was broken. He pointed it out to Alaric. "The message could have been read, sir." Alaric took the message, his face thoughtful. These small demonstrations built a profile. Tomas was not just a laborer, he was a clerk in all but name. He was becoming part of the system's machinery, a cog that understood the clock. The next step was the parish. He needed a reason to speak to the priest, Father Anselm, without raising suspicion. His opportunity came during the spring cleaning of the counting house. He was tasked with taking a sack of old, useless papers to the church for use as kindling or stuffing. It was a common practice. Paper was valuable. He carried the sack across the cobbled square to the church. The interior was cool and dark, smelling of incense and cold stone. Father Anselm was in the vestry, mending a vestment. He was a thin man with tired eyes. Tomas presented the sack. Father Anselm nodded absently. "Put it in the alcove, boy." As Tomas turned to go, he paused. He made his voice small, hesitant. "Father, forgive me. I have a question of conscience." The priest looked up, his needle poised. Tomas continued, looking at the floor. "My father bound me to service with Master Vorin for a debt. I try to be a good servant, but I worry. The contract was registered with the guild. Should it also be with the parish? I do not wish my service to be sinful for lacking proper witness." He framed it as a concern for his soul, not for his freedom. He invoked the language of sin and witness, the priest's domain. Father Anselm put down his needle. He studied Tomas for a long moment. "What is your name, boy?" "Tomas, father, and your father's name?" "Henrik, father, of the village of Oakham." The priest nodded slowly. "It is the law of the guild and the custom to file with the parish. It ensures the church's blessing on the arrangement. I will look into it." He said no more. Tomas thanked him, bowed his head, and left. The seed was planted. It was a tiny thing, a priest's vague intention to look into a filing, but it was a start. It created a connection. If Father Anselm did check and found no filing, his pride as a pastor would be pricked. He might make an inquiry. That inquiry would be the first trigger. Tomas returned to the counting-house, his heart steady. He had not accused, he had not demanded, he had asked for spiritual guidance. It was the perfect cover. He was preparing the trap with the tools of his trade, attention to detail, knowledge of procedure, and now, a carefully crafted approach to human psychology. He was setting the pieces on the board, moving them with a light touch, waiting for the moment when the system itself would begin to move. And he would be there, ready to guide its momentum in the only direction that could lead to his freedom. The trap worked within the social context, not against it. It used the existing structures of authority and record-keeping as its engine. The first sign of movement came not from the priest, but from the guild. A routine notice arrived, delivered by a guild apprentice. It was a reminder to all members about the upcoming annual audit of apprenticeship and service contracts. All masters were to present their registered contracts for inspection at the Guildhall in 2 weeks' time. This was normal. But for Tomas it was an opportunity. It was a public event. If Voron's contract was provisional due to the missing parish filing, it would be noted. The notice sat on Alaric's desk. Tomas saw it when he brought in the morning's letters. He said nothing, but he watched. 2 days later, Father Anselm appeared at the door of the counting-house. He asked to speak with Master Vorin. Vorin was out, so Alaric received him. Tomas, dusting shelves in the corner, listened. The priest's voice was mild but firm. "Master Alaric, I am making inquiries into the parish records. There appears to be no copy of the contract for the boy Tomas, bound to Master Vorin. Guild Statute 15 requires it. I would be grateful if you could provide a copy for our files, or confirm its registration number, so I may request it from the guild." Alaric's response was smooth, professional. "Of course, Father. I will look into it immediately and send a copy around. There must have been an oversight." The priest thanked him and left. The inquiry had been made. It was polite, official, but it was a trigger. Alaric, after the priest left, went to the contract registry book. He found the entry for Tomas. He saw the note, in small script, provisional, parish copy pending. His face tightened. He knew what that meant. It was a minor flaw, but a flaw. In an audit, it would be a mark. He would have to report it or risk greater penalty for concealment. He closed the book and went to his desk. Tomas from his corner continued dusting, his movements slow and even. He was a piece of the furniture unnoticed. The next day, Alaric gave him a task. Take this letter to the Guildhall, to the clerk of contracts. Wait for a reply. The letter was sealed. Tomas took it, his hands steady. He walked through the bustling streets, the sealed parchment feeling heavy in his hand. He delivered it to the clerk's office, a small, stuffy room lined with ledgers. The clerk, a man with ink-stained cuffs, broke the seal, read the letter, and grunted. He scribbled a note on a scrap of paper and handed it to Tomas. "Take this back," the note said, simply, "acknowledged, inspection required, bring original and copy to audit." Tomas returned to the counting house and gave the note to Alaric. Alaric read it, his expression unreadable. He looked at Tomas, the guild ord. "It is in 10 days, you will attend. You will stand when your name is called. You will say nothing unless asked a direct question. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Tomas said. His heart was a drum, but his voice was calm. The mechanism was engaged. The parish inquiry had forced Alaric to acknowledge the provisional status. The guild, upon that acknowledgement, had triggered a deeper inspection. They would demand the original. The trap was set. The setting was the guild hall, a place of wood and stone and authority. The bait was the flawed contract, now under official scrutiny. The spring was the rule, the procedure that demanded the original be produced. And the jaws were the discrepancy in the ink, waiting to be seen by an official whose job was to look for such things. Tomas's role was to be present, to be the silent subject of the contract, to answer if asked about his treatment, to confirm his father's name and mark. He would not accuse, he would not explain the ink. He would simply be there, a living reminder of the transaction, while the documents spoke for themselves. The social context was crucial. In the guild hall, surrounded by his peers, Vorin would be on display. He would have to produce the original. He would have to explain the missing parish copy. He would be accountable to the system he was part of. His network would not protect him here, in the heart of the network itself. They would watch, they would judge his competence in handling his own affairs. If he fumbled, if he could not produce the document, or if the document was flawed, he would lose face. He would be seen as careless, as a man who could not manage the basic paperwork of his power. And in a world built on credit and reputation, that was a serious wound. Tomas prepared himself. He rehearsed his answers. "My name is Tomas. My father is Henrik of Oakham. I have been in service here 4 years. I perform copying and errands." He would offer no more. He would be the model of a dutiful, if unfortunate, servant. The conflict was no longer between Tomas and Vorin. It was between Vorin and the guild's own procedures. Tomas had merely opened the door and invited the procedures in. Now he had to stand aside and let them do their work. The system turned against the exploiters, not through moral outrage, but through the cold logic of its own rules. On the day of the audit, the guild hall was a cavernous space, smelling of old wood, wax, and the sweat of nervous men. The high windows let in bars of dusty light. At a long table sat the guild warden conducting the audit, the clerk of contracts, and a scribe. Masters stood before them in turn, presenting their papers. Tomas stood against the back wall with a group of other servants and apprentices, a silent row of boys in drab clothes. He watched as Master Vorin, dressed in his fine wool gown, stepped forward. Alaric was with him, carrying a leather satchel. The warden, a man named Brewer with a face like a clenched fist, consulted his list. Vorin, contract for one Tomas, son of Henrik, debt service, 10-year term. Registered 4 years ago, status provisional, explain. Vorin's voice was confident, but Tomas heard the slight strain. A minor oversight, Warden Brewer. The parish copy was misfiled. We are rectifying it this week. The warden grunted. Produce the original and the registered copy. Alaric opened the satchel. He laid the registered copy, the perfect guild copy, on the table. Then he reached in for the original. His hand hesitated for a fraction of a second. Tomas from across the room saw it. Alaric's fingers brushed past the folded parchment at the bottom of the satchel, the one from the chest. He pulled it out and placed it beside the copy. The two documents lay side by side on the polished wood. The clerk of contracts leaned forward. He was a different man from the one in the office, older, with watery eyes that saw everything. He picked up the original, he held it to the light from the window, he looked at it for a long time. The only sound was the scratch of the scribe's pen. The clerk put the document down, he pointed a bony finger, the ink, the body text is iron gall, the witness signatures are common oak gall and poorly fixed. They were added after. He looked at Vorin. Is this the original executed at the time of the agreement? Vorin's confidence wavered. Of course it is. The witnesses signed at the time. The clerk's voice was flat. The ink says otherwise. The signatures sit on top of the text here and here. He indicated the overlaps. This document was written and then signed later, perhaps much later. This is irregular. He turned to the warden. The registration is based on a copy of this. If the original is flawed, the registration is flawed. The warden's face darkened. He looked at Vorin. You have a parish inquiry pending. You have a provisional status. And now you present an original with inconsistent ink. This is not a minor oversight. This is negligence. Vorin began to bluster. The boy's father was there. The witnesses are reputable men. The debt was real. The warden cut him off. The debt is not in question. The procedure is. The guild's authority rests on proper procedure. You have failed to follow it. He turned to the clerk. Recommendation. The clerk tapped the flawed original. Suspend the registration. Require the master to produce the witnesses before the full guild council to attest to the proper execution. If they cannot, or if their testimony is unsatisfactory, the contract may be voided for defect of form. Also, a fine for negligence in registry maintenance. The warden nodded. So ordered. The registration of contract for Tomas, son of Henrik, is suspended pending witness verification. Master Vorin, you have 30 days. The audit moved on to the next master. Vorin stood frozen for a moment, his face pale with rage and humiliation. He gathered the documents, his hands trembling slightly. He did not look at Tomas. He turned and walked stiffly from the hall, Alaric following. Tomas remained against the wall, his face a mask of calm. Inside, a quiet storm of triumph and fear raged. The system had worked. It had not freed him. Not yet. It had suspended his bondage. It had turned Vorin's own greed and carelessness against him. Vorin now had to find the witnesses and bring them before the guild council. He had to explain the ink. He had to justify his failure to file with the parish. He was on the defensive. The cost to him was no longer just the potential loss of a servant. It was his reputation, his standing in the guild. He was now a man with a mark against his name. The trap had sprung. The flawed document, the procedural lapse, they had done their work. The system, in protecting its own integrity, had inadvertently become Tomas's ally. It had demanded a standard, and Vorin had failed to meet it. The justice was not poetic. It was bureaucratic. It was a suspension, a fine, a demand for verification. But in that dry, legal language, Tomas saw the first crack of light. The door to his cage was not open, but the lock had been found faulty, and everyone in the room now knew it. The quiet victory was not a parade. It was a series of small, almost invisible changes. Tomas returned to the house of Vorin after the audit, but the air had shifted. He was no longer just the debt boy. He was the subject of a suspended contract, a legal anomaly. For the first few days, Vorin avoided him entirely, a cold, seething presence that filled the house with tension. Then the orders changed. He was no longer sent on heavy labor to the warehouse. He was kept in the counting house, given clerical tasks exclusively. It was not kindness, it was risk management. Vorin could not afford any accusation of mistreatment now, not with the guild watching. Tomas's value had shifted. He was no longer cheap labor. He was a potential liability who happened to be a competent clerk. Alaric began to treat him differently as well. There was a new wariness, but also a flicker of something like respect. One afternoon, Alaric called him over. "The guild has requested a full accounting of the hours you have worked for the valuation of service rendered against the debt. Prepare a summary from the work logs." It was a complex task, requiring him to cross-reference the daily work logs with the quarterly summaries. Tomas set to work. He moved through the ledgers with a calm efficiency, his mind clear. He could feel the weight of the past 4 years in the columns of figures, each entry a day of his life. As he worked, he realized the numbers told a story of their own. The value of his labor, even at the lowest journeyman's rate, had already exceeded the original debt of 40 silver pieces. He finished the summary and presented it to Alaric. Alaric looked it over, his eyebrows raised slightly. He said nothing, but the look was enough. The arithmetic was undeniable. The debt, in terms of labor value, was paid. This was not a legal argument, but a moral and practical one. It added weight to the suspension. Why fight to keep a servant whose work had already cancelled the debt? It made Vorin's position look not just procedurally flawed, but gratuitously harsh. The next change was more personal. One evening, as Tomas was leaving the counting house, Marta stopped him. She held out a bundle. It was a shirt newly mended, the stitches neat and strong. She did not meet his eyes. "Your other one is falling apart," she said, her voice gruff. He took it. "Thank you," he said. She gave a short nod and turned away. The gift was different this time. It was not just sustenance, it was care. It acknowledged that he had a future that might require presentable clothing. The quietest victory was the reclaiming of his name. In the house, they still called him boy sometimes. But in the guild correspondence, in the legal notices, he was Tomas, son of Henrik. He was an individual with a legal identity, however precarious. He began to think of himself that way again, not as a function, but as a person with a past and a possible future. He allowed himself to remember the forest near Oakham, the smell of pine and damp earth. The memories were no longer painful ghosts. They were landmarks, proof that he had existed before this place. He did not know what would happen in 30 days when Vorin had to present his witnesses. The tavern keeper might be bribed, the guild brother would likely lie. But the ink discrepancy was a fact that no testimony could easily explain, and the guild's own clerk had seen it. The suspension might become permanent. The contract might be voided. Or Vorin might be forced to renegotiate its terms, perhaps converting it into a true apprenticeship with an end date and a path forward. Tomas did not know. But for the first time, the future was not a closed door. It was a question. And he had a voice in the answer, not because he was strong, but because he had been attentive. He had paid the price in years of silent observation, and now he was reaping the interest in the currency of information and procedure. He sat on his pallet that night, the mended shirt folded beside him. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the settling of the embers in the hearth. He felt the rough wool of the blanket, smelled the familiar scents of smoke and herbs. These sensations were no longer just the textures of his prison. They were the textures of a life he was slowly, carefully reclaiming. The victory was not freedom yet, it was agency. It was the knowledge that he had outmaneuvered a powerful man not by force, but by thought. He had turned the system's own rules into a lever, and with that lever he had pried open a space for himself. It was a small space, but it was his. And in that space he could breathe. Tomas's story is not an isolated fairy tale. It is a single thread in a vast, ancient tapestry of human resistance. Across time and culture, when formal power was entrenched and law served the master, the oppressed developed a shared logic of survival. They learned to outsmart, not overthrow. Consider the Hebrew midwives in the book of Exodus, who defied Pharaoh's order to kill newborn boys not by open rebellion, but by claiming the Hebrew women were too vigorous and gave birth before the midwives arrived. They used a plausible, technical excuse rooted in their professional expertise. They fought with their trade. Or the medieval peasant who, bound by serfdom, would use the manorial court not to challenge the lord's authority, but to insist on the precise terms of the custom. He would argue over the number of days owed, the size of the loaf paid as rent, the boundaries of the strip. He would use the Lord's own legal system to constrain the Lord's power, turning procedure into a shield. In the American South, enslaved people used coded songs, the Bible's stories of deliverance, and subtle acts of sabotage like working slow or feigning illness. Not to launch a revolt, but to carve out spaces of autonomy and dignity within an inhuman system. They became experts in the psychology of their masters, learning which behaviors would be punished and which might be tolerated. The pattern is clear. When you cannot break the system, you study it. You learn its language better than those who speak it casually. You find its inconsistencies, its hypocrisies, its lazy assumptions. You discover that the powerful are often less attentive to the details of their own rules, because they do not have to live by them in the same way. The loopholes relied upon were not secret laws. They were the gaps between the law as written and the law as lived. They were the forgotten filing, the missed muster, the unenforced clause, the witness who could not be found, the ink that did not match. They were the bureaucratic equivalent of the loose stone in the castle wall. The historical lesson is that intelligence in these contexts is a form of labor. It is the work of paying attention when no one is watching you. It is the cultivation of memory, of patience, of precise observation. It is the quiet building of a case, not for a court of law necessarily, but for the court of circumstance. For the moment when the master's carelessness meets an official's need to uphold procedure. This is why folk tales across the world are filled with clever youngest sons, wise animals, and humble servants who win not by strength, but by wit. These stories were survival manuals. They taught that the giant is stupid, the witch is vain, the king is easily flattered. They taught that the powerful have blind spots, and that the small and the overlooked can exploit those blind spots if they are smart and careful. They taught that the weapon of the weak is not the sword, but the needle, the riddle, the remembered detail. Tomas's victory connects to this deep history. He did what countless others have done. He survived inside the system long enough to understand it. He used his position, however lowly, to gather information. He turned his forced labor into an education in the mechanisms of his own bondage. And when the time was right, he used that education to trigger the system's own corrective mechanisms. He did not become a hero. He became a competent clerk who noticed an error, and in a world run on paperwork, that was enough. The story of Tomas is a medieval case study in a universal principle. When the law protects the powerless must become experts in the loopholes of the law. They must learn to read the contract, to check the ink, to know the filing deadlines. They must fight with the tools they have, which are often the very tools the system gave them to keep them in their place. For Tomas, it was a quill and a ledger. For others, it was a song, a prayer, a slow pace of work, a knowledge of the land. The method varies, the logic endures. Pay attention, remember, wait, and when you see the detail they missed, use it. The 30-day period passed. Master Vorin produced one witness before the guild council, the guild brother. The tavern keeper could not be found, having left the city. The guild brother testified that he had signed at the time of the agreement. He could not explain the ink discrepancy. The clerk of contracts presented his observation. The guild warden reviewed the case. The contract for Tomas, son of Henrik, remained suspended. No formal voidance was declared, but no reinstatement was granted. The suspension became indefinite. In practical terms, Tomas's bond was frozen. He continued to live and work in the house of Vorin, but his legal status was in limbo. He was neither slave nor free. He was a suspended clause. Master Vorin, facing guild fines and damaged reputation, chose not to pursue the matter further. The cost of fighting outweighed the value of the remaining 6 years of service. The debt of 40 silver pieces was considered satisfied by 4 years of labor and the trouble caused. No document declared this. It was an understanding arrived at through exhausted calculation. Tomas remained as a clerk. His wages were not mentioned, but his meals improved. His pallet was given a thicker straw mattress. He was given a proper bench at the copying desk, not a stool. These were not gifts. They were adjustments to a new equilibrium. Alaric began to train him in earnest in the analysis of ledgers, not just their copying. The skill he had cultivated in secret was now openly cultivated. The system had not been broken, it had been bent. It had absorbed the anomaly and continued, but within that continuity, Tomas had changed position. He was no longer at the bottom, he was somewhere in the middle, a recognized function with expertise. He had a trade now, he was a clerk. His name was Tomas. He had a future, not as a master, but as a skilled man who could read numbers and spot inconsistencies. The story does not end with a wedding or a crown. It ends with a man at a desk, the smell of ink in the air, the sound of a pen scratching. He is copying a document, his hand is steady, his memory is sharp. He knows where to look for errors. He understands the rules. He is inside the system. And he is watching.